The Masque was in the basement of a porno theater, the Pussycat Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, in a really, really rotten area of Hollywood that was crawling with hookers and drug addicts. When you went to a show, even though there were a lot of rooms to the Masque, they were small rooms. So even if there was only 50 or 100 people there, everyone would be all squished together, and it would be really sweaty and really loud and bashing into each other and doing the pogo, which was just like basically jumping up and down for an hour. There wasn't the whole mosh pit thing came later, and to me was sort of like this artificially created thing that came from more of like when I was a punk rocker, when we old timers were doing punk rock, it was like you were just all fucked up on pills and booze and stuff, and you just naturally were falling into each other, right? So, and it was like a lot more like enthusiasm and happiness than sort of this, later on it turned into this whole like macho thing where the guys would get out there and like slam heads together or whatever. Everyone was pretty young. I would say like from teenage to maybe mid-20s. Was, you know, you were pretty old if you were in your mid-20s. And everyone was kind of like into the whole homemade thing, because there wasn't really, you couldn't buy like real punk clothes like they could in London. And I remember seeing pictures from over in London, and it was just so impressive. Like it just seemed so organized and so real. And this was more like, much more like this homemade scene. And there was very few of us at first. I mean, maybe 50 or 100 kids or something. And maybe it spread to a few hundred people, but it was a really, really tiny scene. And when I think back on how influential that little movement was just on the future of rock in general, I think, wow, how amazing is that? Because there was really not that much to it. And I remember as a punk rocker in like the late 70s that you never thought that punk was the be-all and end-all. I mean, God, if someone had told me it would still be going on in 1999, I would not have believed it. But the idea of like punk as like a genre surviving was just ludicrous, because it was sort of like this totally like homemade, self-created, self-destructing, disposable thing. You know, it wasn't meant to like last. To me, like the beginning of the scene was a lot more like community, like us against the world kind of thing, and we hated the hippies, so there's always lots of songs about hating hippies, and we hated the cops, of course, because the cops were mean to us, and we were basically sort of like the outcasts and you know, garbage of society. And that was kind of fun for me, because I had grown up in this total like middle class white, total like nice upbringing, and then I was so rebellious as a teenager. Punk rock was just perfect for me. I mean, my parents were just horrified by me. I mean, they were already just thought I was out of my mind and had tried to get me committed and all this stuff. But when I started coming home with purple hair, then they really freaked out. I remember my mom crying and saying, "You need help," and you know, like, "Why are you making yourself ugly? You're such a pretty girl," and you know, all that like really classic mom stuff. I went through all of that. It was great. I wanted to be in a band, but I didn't know how to go about doing it, because I didn't know how to play anything. I didn't really have any talent. But that wasn't stopping anyone else. Like everybody was doing it, and ultimately what ended up happening and how the Go-Gos kind of got together by default is like all the guys already had bands, at least one band. A lot of people were in 3-4 bands, and the only people left were a few of the girls. A lot of the girls also were in a band. So in spring of '78, you know, some of us girls got together and decided to do the Go-Gos, and it started out real, just like classic LA punk rock, and a lot of like angry lyrics and stuff. The first Go-Gos gig was, I believe, in July of '78, and it was down at the Masque, and it was a big party for the Dickies, who were sort of the first band to get a record deal. And we did 2.5 songs, and we couldn't remember how to play the third song, so we stopped in the middle of it and then replayed one of the first songs. And we were just like a charming disaster. I think people just thought we were sort of cute and funny and entertaining and terrible all at the same time. Right from the beginning, all of us had a love for pop music and had grown up listening to the Beatles, so there was always that kind of like in the back of our minds. And as time went on, you know, obviously the Go-Gos evolved more and more into just being more of a pop band than a punk band, and then the whole new wave thing happened, and you know, by 81 or whatever, the world was ready to like take a sort of like less threatening punky pop band and make them, you know, like a hit. So we were kind of like the ones that did something out of that scene, and it was great, and I'm really proud of it. But I remember also at the time that it was very like ostracizing, like it set us apart, and people said we were sellouts and all that kind of stuff. And you know, looking back on it now, I just laugh at it, and I think it's funny and stupid, and probably everyone else does too. But at the time, it was hard because I, you know, went from being like this hardcore punk chick to being like America's sweetheart. And it was very bizarre because like we hadn't changed at all personally. I mean, we were still like, you know, just totally partying and being mess-ups and just making fun of everybody and everything. And but then we had this image of being like these squeaky clean cheerleader types. So when we formed, there were different kinds of punk bands. It wasn't just everyone sounded like the Sex Pistols or something. There was a real broad range. I mean, there were bands that were like real musicians that were bringing in like weird jazz stuff into it, and then there were people on the poppier end, or people like the Dickies that were on the sillier end, or people like the Screamers that were more electronic. With the Go-Gos, we kind of looked to, I think our biggest influence would have been the Buzzcocks, you know, British band that was real poppy punk, and that's what we wanted to do, something that was like fast and furious but still melodic. And so, you know, it started out that way, and then as we learned to play a little bit better, and as Charlotte and I became sort of a songwriting team, and our styles kind of gelled together, the music became, I think, more and more pop and less punk. We got signed at the beginning of 1981 and immediately went to New York to record our album there because we were working with this producer, Richard Goderer, who had written some of the great girl group classics of the 60s. So that was cool because we were really into sort of like paying tribute to them, and then also had produced Blondie's first album, and Blondie was kind of the first sort of punk / new wave band to get anywhere. You know, they were like kind of like had sort of infiltrated into real society. So we were impressed by that. So by the beginning of 81, we were basically out of the LA scene and moving on, because like we made the record in New York and it came out like, you know, a month or two later, and from that moment on we just toured and toured and toured and toured. I mean, we started out doing little club tours, which was interesting in itself because we got to see like the local music scene in every town in America, and there were certain towns that stood out. We were talking about DC having the 930 Club, and I remember Atlanta having a pretty good scene, and like a few, you know, there'd be a few cities, and obviously New York had a great scene, but then there'd be tons of towns that were, it was just completely clueless. Like I remember, I think it was St. Louis where we pulled up, and it said tonight the Go-Go Girls, and so we get there and it's like a biker club, and they're thinking it's like a go-go dancing review, and they start getting all pissed off at us because we're not taking our clothes off and dancing. We're like, we're a punk rock band, you assholes, and it was like this whole thing. So stuff like that, you know, would happen a lot, which is kind of fun. But then, I mean, it's just kind of like weird with the Go-Gos that here we are, that's sort of like punky pop band signed to this label that's never done anything and no one's ever heard of. I mean, they were just kind of like this tiny little baby label, and somehow we just caught on, and we toured again and again, and then we opened for the Police, and we're playing these stadiums, and a couple years ago, we were kind of like stealing the leftovers off of Madness's catering because we didn't have, food. It's like weird to go from one extreme to the other that way. And then by, I guess it was the beginning of '82, our album was #1, and all of a sudden we were like rock stars. And that was really weird because all of a sudden we were, part of the whole corporate make money, be accepted by society thing when we'd really been a few years ago like rebels and outcasts. Very odd experience. Hard to handle. Kind of more fun in retrospect than when it was happening. The Go-Gos were the first band that wrote their own music and played their own instruments and were women that got really successful. So that's kind of cool, That's, my big claim to fame, and I'm really happy it happened, but I don't really see this huge impact. I mean, I don't really think music has changed all that much. I mean, yeah, you have a bunch of chick singers, but, so what? You did in the 40s, too. And I'm not putting them down. That's great. Girls that sing, whatever, that's really cool. I'm happy for them. But I just thought, like, by 1999, it would be sort of like Even Steven, where you'd have just as many female bands as male bands, or at least just as many female musicians, and it hasn't fucking happened, and I don't know why.